The wind moved softly along the old main street of Redwood Crossing, carrying the scent of dust, horses, and the quiet breath of a town that had seen too much change in too few years. The sun hung low over the wooden rooftops, bathing everything in a warm gold that made even the roughest boards look gentler than they truly were. Folks stepped out of the general store, nodded at neighbors, and went about their business with the slow rhythm that only frontier towns carried. But on that particular morning, something shifted. Something subtle. Something that made two ranch hands stop sweeping the porch of the saloon and glance toward the far end of the road. That was when she appeared. A wagon rolled into town, creaking under the weight of a trunk that looked too heavy for someone as delicate as the woman sitting beside it. She wore a simple prairie dress, dusty from miles of travel, and her blonde curls had loosened under the restless wind. Yet there was a quiet strength in her eyes, the kind that spoke of a long journey and a heart determined to find a place where it could finally rest. Her name was Lyria. No one in Redwood Crossing had ever seen her before. But the moment she stepped down from that wagon, it felt as if the whole town paused to study her. She clasped her hands tightly, scanning the street as if searching for someone she had never met but desperately hoped would find her. Her voice trembled only slightly as she asked the driver where she might find the man she had traveled all this way to meet. The driver tipped his hat toward the blacksmith shop standing near the center of the street. The sound of iron striking iron rang through the air, steady and powerful. Lyria gathered her courage and walked toward the shop, every step carrying pieces of her past she wished she could leave behind. Shadows of a life filled with misunderstanding, whispers, and cold nights lay heavy on her. But she tried not to think about that now. This was her chance for a new beginning. A safer beginning. A place far away from the troubles that had chased her for far too long. The blacksmith shop glowed from inside. Sparks flashed like tiny fireflies as a tall man-shaped metal on the anvil with unwavering force. His name was Alder, known across the frontier for his calm nature and unmatched work. His broad shoulders carried the weight of many seasons, and his quiet eyes held stories no one dared ask about. He was respected and feared in equal measure, for he stood firm against troublemakers and offered his silence as a shield for those who sought safety. Many women in town admired him, but Alder rarely looked twice at anyone. Not because he lacked feeling, but because he kept them buried deep, far from where anyone could reach. When Lyria stepped into the doorway, Alder felt her presence before he even looked up. Something in the room shifted, the air thickening for a heartbeat. He raised his gaze, surprised to find a stranger studying him with hopeful eyes. She looked fragile, yet resilient, as if carved by life into someone who had endured more than she ever spoke of. She swallowed, trying to steady her voice. She told him her purpose. She told him she had come because she had nowhere else to go. She told him she had heard he needed someone to help with his new homestead outside town. Someone to cook for the ranch hands, mend linens, and tend to the small cabin he rarely visited during busy weeks. She explained that she was willing to work, willing to learn, and willing to start from nothing if it meant she could live without fear again. Alder wiped his hands on his leather apron and studied the woman before him. He did not speak for several moments, weighing her words with the same care he used when shaping iron. He was not a man who took in strangers. Folks knew him as guarded, even distant. But something in Lyria's eyes, maybe the way they held both fear and quiet defiance, stirred a feeling in him he had not felt in years. He nodded once, slow and firm, agreeing to give her a chance if she truly wished to work. Relief softened her shoulders, and she whispered a grateful thank you. But then came the moment that would follow her for the rest of her life. Alder gestured toward the open door leading to the small washroom at the back of the shop. Lyria, exhausted from travel and covered in dust, misunderstood his gesture completely. She thought his words meant she needed to prepare herself for the duties of the ranch, that she must change into cleaner clothing before meeting the rest of the crew. Her heart raced, her mind filled with worry. She had known other men who used kindness as a mask for intentions she never wanted to face again. The idea that she might have walked into another trap sent a cold shiver down her spine. She lowered her gaze, gathered her courage, and asked the question that had haunted her since the wagon wheels rolled into town. She asked it softly, almost as if she wished the wind could carry the words away before anyone heard them. She asked where she should undress. The hammer and alders. Hand dropped to the floor in a sharp clang. For the first time in a long while, the calm, steady blacksmith showed a flash of emotion. Not anger. Not shock. Something deeper. Something protective. Something that rose in him like a flame, refusing to be ignored. He took a single step forward. His voice, firm yet gentle, changed both their lives. What he said in that moment cleared the dust between them and built something unexpected. His answer did not shame her. It did not frighten her. It did not belittle her. It told her she was safe. It told her she had been misunderstood for far too long. It told her she had finally come to a place where the world would not demand from her what it had stolen in the past. But just as his words reached her, a loud shout echoed from the street outside. Hooves thundered against the dirt. A commotion stirred the quiet town as several riders stormed down the road, dust rising behind them. Their voices carried Lyria's name, spoken with a tone that sent fear trembling through her. Alder turned toward the doorway, his jaw tightening. The moment of peace between them shattered as trouble approached. Lyria's hands trembled again, not because of confusion this time, but because she knew exactly who those riders were, and she knew what they wanted. Alder moved in front of her, blocking her from view as the shadows of the riders stretched longer across the doorway. Lyria pressed her hand against her chest, trying to steady herself as the man who had just offered her safety now stood between her and the danger. She thought she had escaped. The riders slowed, searching, calling her name with a cold certainty that made her blood run cold. She wanted to step back, to hide, to disappear. But Alder's presence kept her from collapsing under the weight of her fear. His answer had changed her life. But the danger roaring toward the blacksmith shop was about to change everything else. The truth about Lyria's past, and the reason she had traveled all this way, had found her again, and Alder, without knowing a thing about her secrets, was about to step into a storm that would test both their destinies. Would he still protect her once he learned the truth she carried? Would he still stand by the woman who had walked into his life with nothing but a trunk and a trembling voice? The riders halted outside, dust swirling around their horses as they prepared to dismount. Lyria held her. Alder stepped closer to the doorway, and the future of Redwood Crossing shifted in that fragile moment. Waiting for the storm to break, the dust rose slowly as the riders came to a stop outside the blacksmith shop, their horses snorting and pawing at the ground as if they felt the same fire burning inside their owners. The leader, a broad man with a scar stretching across his cheek, swung down from his saddle with a heavy thud. His boots struck the ground like warnings, and Alder knew immediately that whoever these men were, they were not here for a friendly talk. Lyria stood behind him, her breath shaky, her hands clenched together in a way that showed she was fighting the urge to run. She did not step forward or try to speak. Instead, she stayed close to the workbench, as if the rough wooden surface could shield her from the storm pressing in on her. Alder sensed her fear before she said a word. He could feel it in the air, almost taste it. There were plenty of strangers who passed through Redwood Crossing, but the way these men called her name, the coldness in their tone, the tension riding in the leader's shoulders, all of it told Alder this was no simple misunderstanding. This was something older, heavier, rooted in a past she had hoped to bury. The iron in Alder's hands had cooled, but a different kind of heat rose in his chest as he stepped into the doorway. The scarred man glanced inside the shop, his dark eyes narrowing as he saw Alder standing firm. Behind him, the other riders spread out, blocking the main road. People peeked from behind windows and saloon doors, whispering among themselves. Trouble in Redwood Crossing always traveled fast, and this kind of trouble traveled even faster. Alder did not raise his voice, but he made sure every word reached the stranger. Clearly, he asked who they were looking for and why they were calling Lyria's name as if she were a wanted outlaw. The leader smirked, a cruel curl of the mouth that carried more threat than a loaded rifle. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his head slightly, studying the town around him as if trying to decide whether he should take what he came for by force or by fear. Lyria felt her knees weaken as he finally spoke. His voice carried that coldness she knew too well. He announced that he was searching for a runaway, someone who owed a debt, someone who had left behind responsibilities she had no right to abandon. He made it sound simple, lawful even. But there was something in the way he said responsibility that twisted inside Lyria's stomach like a knife. She pressed her hand against her chest, trying to steady the pounding heartbeat threatening to give away her hiding place. Alder didn't move from the doorway. He asked another question, this time sharper, asking whether the woman they sought had committed any crime in the eyes of the law. The leader's jaw tightened, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. The men behind him shifted uneasily, waiting to see how he would answer. He hesitated before saying she had broken no written law, but she belonged to a situation that needed her return. Alder felt the shift. The absence of legal accusation told him more than any shouted threat. He stepped out onto the porch, forcing the leader to raise his chin to meet him eye to eye. The two men stood only a few feet apart now, the tension between them thick as the heat rising from the anvil behind Alder. He said that Redwood Crossing was no place for men to claim another human being as property, no place to drag someone back to a life they had fled in fear. His voice stayed steady, but there was a warning in it that even strangers could understand. The leader scoffed and waved his hand toward the shop door, saying he knew Lyria was inside, that he wanted no trouble, only what was owed. Alder stepped even closer, standing between the strangers and the small fragile piece inside the shop. His presence alone made the riders shift on their feet. He was not holding a weapon, but there was something in his stance, in the strength of his silence, that made them treat him as if he were armed. Inside, Lyria watched him, trying to understand why a man she had met only moments earlier was willing to stand against riders who looked ready to tear the town apart. She wasn't sure how this had become her life. She didn't understand how she had reached the point where her name could spark such fear in her chest. But she knew one thing. She could not go back. Whatever she had left behind, whatever she had escaped, she could not return to it. Not even for safety. Not even for survival. Alder glanced back at her for only a second. But that second was enough for her to see something she had not seen in years. Someone was willing to hear her side. Someone was willing to believe her, even before knowing the whole truth. And that truth was heavier than any trunk she carried. The leader snapped his fingers, and one of the riders handed him a folded letter. He tossed it toward Alder, who caught it midair. The paper was creased and dirty, as if it had been handled too many times. Alder opened it, his eyes moving across the page slowly. Lyria knew what he was reading. She knew the story, those words twisted. The tale someone else had written about her life. A story where she looked guilty. A story where her voice had never been heard. Alder folded the letter and slipped it into his vest. He looked at the leader again, but this time something colder had entered his eyes. He asked what the men planned to do if she refused to return. The leader chuckled darkly, saying they had ways of convincing her. That single sentence made Lyria's breath catch, and Alder's shoulders stiffen. Before Alder could speak again, an older man who ran the general store appeared on the street, shouting for the riders to leave town if they had no lawful business. Others stepped out too, men with worn hands and tired faces who had lived through enough danger to recognize the type when they saw it. Redwood Crossing wasn't big, but its people were not weak, and they stood behind Alder now, quiet but firm. The leader's smirk faded as he realized he wouldn't be able to drag Lyria out of the shop without starting something he might not win. The riders exchanged glances, uncertain whether they should fight or retreat. The man touched the scar along his cheek, then pointed toward Alder with a warning. He said this wasn't over. He said he would return. He said Lyria belonged to a promise she had broken, and no town on the frontier could hide her forever. They mounted their horses and rode off, leaving a trail of dust behind them. The townsfolk slowly stepped back into their stores, murmuring about what they had witnessed. But Alder didn't move until the riders disappeared beyond the ridge. Only then did he step back inside. Lyria stood trembling, her fear mixing with shame and confusion. She started to explain, to tell him she hadn't meant to cause trouble, that she would leave if he wanted her gone. But Alder raised a hand gently, telling her she didn't need to speak until she was ready. His voice carried no judgment, only steadiness, only patience. She sank onto a small stool, her breath uneven. She felt like a runaway being held together by nothing more than hope and exhaustion. The truth pulled at her ribs, begging to be told, yet she didn't know where to begin. She didn't know how much he would believe. She didn't know if he would still help her once he learned everything. Alder poured her a cup of water and set it before her, then sat on the opposite bench, giving her space, yet offering quiet presence. He didn't press her for answers. He didn't question her fear. He knew enough to understand that some stories needed time to be spoken. He had his own past he didn't share with strangers, and he suspected she carried something just as heavy outside. The sun continued its slow journey across the sky, but inside the blacksmith shop, time felt suspended. Lyria lifted the cup with shaking hands. She wanted to trust this place. She wanted to trust this man. But the weight of what waited in her past made her feel as if the floor beneath her might give way. Alder finally asked her the question she had been expecting, not who the riders were, not what she had done. He asked her whether she wished to stay and whether she truly wanted a new beginning. Lyria's breath hitched as she nodded. For the first time in years, she felt the edge of a life she had thought impossible. But the sound of the riders' voices still echoed in her mind. The scarred man's warning still clung to her thoughts. She whispered that staying would put him in danger. Alder didn't flinch. He simply told her danger had never been something he feared. What he feared was standing by while someone suffered without reason. And now that he had seen her fear with his own eyes, he wasn't about to walk away from it. But even as his words steadied her, a new tremor of dread moved through her, because the scarred man had been right. About one thing. Her past wasn't done with her, and the promise she had broken was far more complicated than Alder knew. Lyria woke before the sun the next morning. Long before the roosters in Redwood Crossing called the town to life, sleep had come in short bursts, broken by memories and the sound of riders in her head that were no longer there. She lay on the narrow cot in the small room behind the blacksmith shop, staring at the ceiling boards and listening to the soft creak of the town as it stretched awake. For a moment she wondered if she should leave before Alder came down from his own room upstairs. If she slipped away now, before the town really woke, she might spare him trouble. The scarred man would soon return, and when he did, anyone standing near her would be dragged into the storm. But then she heard Alder move about, heard the quiet scrape of a chair, smelled the faint scent of coffee and wood smoke. The sounds were simple and steady. They weighed against her fear. She sat up and pressed a hand against her chest, reminding herself that she had come all this way seeking a different kind of life. Running again would only keep her tied to the old one. When she stepped into the main room of the shop, Alder was already at the forge, the glow of the coals painting his jaw in orange light. He nodded without staring, as if seeing a woman step out of a back room was the most natural thing in the world. There was no demand in his eyes, no silent expectation, only a quiet invitation to share the morning. He handed her a simple tin cup. The warmth of the drink moved through her like courage. She thanked him, slightly embarrassed as yesterday's misunderstanding flashed in her mind. She remembered her own words, so small and frightened, asking where she should undress. She remembered the way her voice had trembled, expecting the worst, and she remembered his answer. Where she should undress. She remembered the way her voice had trembled, expecting the worst, and she remembered his answer. He had not laughed. He had not taken advantage of her fear. He had looked straight at her and spoken with steady concern. He had told her that in his home and in his work, a woman undressed only for comfort or rest, never for duty or debt. He had said her work was at the stove, at the ledger, with the laundry and the small cabin on his land, but that her dignity was never part of the job. His words had been simple, but they had struck her heart like a bell. Nobody had spoken to her like that in years. Now, as the sunrise laid a pale stripe of light across the dusty floor, she felt the weight of that answer again. It was the start of a new kind of trouble, the kind that comes when a heart begins to hope. The town slowly stirred. A boy pushing a wheelbarrow passed by, peeking through the open doorway to see if the blacksmith was ready for another day. Two older ranchers led a limping horse toward the shop, talking about a broken shoe and a long ride north. Life seemed set on pretending that nothing unusual had happened the day before, but Lyria knew better. Trouble had only gone quiet, not away. Alder began his work, the rhythm of hammer and anvil filling the shop with a steady beat. He showed her where he kept the clean cloths, where she could wash up, where the simple stew pot sat near the stove. He asked if she knew how to keep a ledger. When she nodded, he slid over a worn book filled with old orders and payments. Many of the pages were marked with pencil instead of ink. He said she could put them in proper shape if she wished. As the morning went on, Lyria learned how the town fit together. The general store owner, Elder Hobb, stopped by for a quick repair on his wagon wheel, leaving behind quiet advice that she should visit his wife if she needed anything. The widowed schoolteacher, Mara, passed on her way to the small schoolhouse, pausing at the door to welcome Lyria with a kind smile. On the street, the sheriff, a lean man named Dalton Cole, tipped his hat and studied the shop with narrowed eyes. He had heard about the riders. He had a talent for hearing things. Dalton stepped inside when the ranchers left, resting his hand on the doorframe. He greeted Alder, then let his gaze drift toward Lyria. She straightened her shoulders, unsure how much Alder had told him. The sheriff's eyes were not unkind, but they were searching. He asked simple questions at first. How many riders? What they said. Whether any of them had reached for a weapon? When Alder described the scarred leader and the letter he had handed over, Dalton's jaw tightened. He stretched out his hand, asking to see the paper. Alder hesitated, then passed it to him. Lyria watched the sheriff read the false story written about her, that she had abandoned a binding agreement, run away from a wealthy cattle baron named Coulter Reddick, and taken with her a sum of money that was never hers. Her fingers curled into the apron she wore. None of it told the part where Coulter's promises had turned to threats, where his men had stood in her doorway at night, reminding her that a deal signed in ink could also be enforced in shadow. The letter called her a runaway, never a victim. Dalton folded the paper and slid it into his pocket. His voice remained even as he spoke, but Lyria saw his eyes cloud over with thought. He said there was no legal seal, no judge's mark, nothing that gave the riders the right to drag someone away. At the same time, he warned that men like Coulter Reddick had their own ways of claiming what they wanted. If Reddick wanted Lyria returned, he would not stop at one visit after the sheriff left. The day carried on, but it did not feel ordinary. Lyria felt watched, not by Alder, but by the world itself, as if the sky were waiting to see whether she would stand her ground or run. She tried to keep busy. She swept the floor, organized tools, and cleared a small corner for storing her trunk. At times she paused, listening for the distant sound of hooves that might signal the rider's return. As the sun climbed higher, another figure entered the picture, tugging along a smaller form. A ranch girl named Tessa hurried into the shop with her little brother. Jory, the boy, clutched a bent horseshoe that he had dug up behind their barn. He insisted it was lucky and wanted Alder to fix it. Lyria watched as Alder crouched down to Jory's level and listened seriously to the request, as if repairing a lucky charm were just as important as shoeing a valuable horse. While Alder warmed the metal, Tessa moved closer to Lyria, whispering questions in a rush. Was she staying in town? Was she working for Alder? Had she really stood behind him when the dangerous riders came? The girl's eyes shone with admiration and curiosity. Lyria felt heat rise in her cheeks. She answered gently, saying she was only trying to help with the shop and the cabin. She did not speak of the fear that had held her like a rope around the chest. Tessa did not need to know that part. Yet the children brought a softer thread into the day. Jory offered Lyria a crooked smile and asked if she knew any stories from far away. She promised to share one some evening if Alder allowed her to visit their ranch. In that instant, she saw something she had never dared imagine. A life where her presence in a town meant more than whispered rumors and signed contracts. As evening neared, Alder hitched up his wagon to take a load of finished tools and repaired gear out to the small cabin on his land. He invited Lyria to ride along, saying she should see the place that would be more her home than the back room of the shop. She hesitated at first, worried that leaving town might make it easier for the riders to find her alone. But something in Alder's steady gaze gave her courage. She climbed onto the wagon seat beside him, careful to keep her hands folded in her lap, the trunk tied at the back. The road to Alder's cabin ran along the edge of open fields, then cut through a stand of cottonwoods whose leaves whispered with every breeze. The ranchland spread out like a rough quilt, scattered with cattle, fences, and the occasional windmill pumping life from the ground. It was quiet here, honest quiet. Not the heavy silence of a big house filled with secrets and locked doors. Alder pointed out the landmarks in his calm way. That hill where a storm once trapped him with a busted cart. That creek where a colt had nearly drowned before he pulled it to shore. He seldom spoke of himself, yet his stories showed more of his heart than any proud speech ever could. Lyria listened, feeling the tension inside her loosen one small knot at a time. When they reached the cabin, she saw a simple building with a stone chimney, a wide porch, and fields stretching behind it. There was a small corral, an old oak tree, and a line where she could hang laundry. It was not grand. It was not rich. But it was real. Alder helped her down from the wagon and let her walk through the doorway first. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and pine. A sturdy table sat near the window. A narrow bed stood against one wall, clean but plain. There were shelves for dishes, hooks for coats, a worn chair near the fireplace. Lyria stepped slowly, touching each piece as if it might vanish. This was a place where she could cook without fear, sleep without listening for footsteps in the hall, breathe without someone counting the cost of each breath. Alder watched her quietly. Then he reminded her that the job was simple. Keep the cabin in order. Prepare meals for him and sometimes for a ranch hand or two. Help with bookkeeping. Nothing more. No hidden demands. No secrets. His words should have reassured her, and in many ways they did. Yet they also deepened the conflict beating in her chest. Because for the first time since she fled Colter Reddick's ranch, she wanted to stay in a place. Really stay. And that desire made her feel vulnerable. Colter had a way of poisoning anything she loved. If he learned how much the simple cabin meant to her, he would aim right at it, as the sun dipped low and painted the cabin in warm light. Lyria helped Alder prepare a small supper. They moved around each other in easy silence, still learning each other's pace. Once, when she reached for a pot on a high shelf and lost her balance, Alder caught it with one hand and steadied her with the other. Their eyes met for a heartbeat. She felt the memory of her own fearful question rise in the air between them. The one she had asked in confusion and shame on that first day. Where should I undress? She almost apologized again. But Alder shook his head with a faint smile, as if reading her thoughts. He told her she never needed to ask that in his presence again. That there were no hidden rooms or secret expectations here. That what he wanted from her was work done with honesty. And in return she would have a roof, food, and respect. The word respect settled over her like a blanket. It warmed her and frightened her at the same time. She had seen men who used gentle words as bait. She had seen promises crumble into control. Was Alder truly different, or was she too tired to see the trap? Night fell before they rode back toward town. The stars came out one by one, clear and sharp in the cold sky. The wagon wheels creaked softly along the trail. Both of them were quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. Alder wondered what kind of man Colter Reddick really was, and why Lyria would risk such danger to flee him. Lyria wondered whether she had any right to pull Alder into her war when he could have chosen an easier life without a frightened stranger at his side. As they neared, they saw a small glow on the horizon that did not belong to lanterns or moonlight. Alder slowed the wagon, his eyes narrowing. Lyria's hand went to the edge of the seat as unease swept over her. The glow flickered brighter, then dimmed, as if someone was signaling in the darkness. It was not the kind of light a peaceful town made somewhere, out on the open ground beyond the last fence line. A campfire burned where no camp should be, and Lyria knew before Alder said a word. That the riders who had called her name were not done with Redwood Crossing yet. The glow on the open land pulsed in the night air like a warning flame. Too steady to be an accident and too far from any ranch to be harmless, Alder tightened his grip on the reins, slowing the wagon until the horses began to shift uneasily. Lyria leaned forward a little, trying to understand what she was seeing. The wind carried faint voices, low and rough, drifting across the fields. Even from this distance, she recognized the tone. Riders who moved with purpose, men who had not given up. Her heart beat faster. She felt the old fear rise, curling cold around her ribs. It's the same fear she thought she had left behind when she fled Reddick's land. Alder said nothing at first, studying the glow, listening to the wind. The horses stomped at the ground, unsettled by what their senses understood before humans did. Finally, Alder flicked the reins gently and steered the wagon toward a small cluster of trees, away from the open trail. They waited there a moment in shadow. He told Lyria they would circle around, enter town from the east road, and avoid the fire altogether. It was safer. It was wiser. But Lyria knew what the fire meant. Reddick's men had not ridden home. They were camping outside Redwood Crossing, watching the roads like hunters waiting for a deer to step into their sights. They were settling in for a long stay. The idea struck her hard. They weren't chasing anymore. They were waiting. That meant Reddick wanted her back more than she thought. It meant he had plans for her that went beyond revenge or pride, and that made her blood run sharp with dread. On the wagon ride back, neither spoke much, but both felt the tension thickening around them. The sky glittered with stars too bright for such a dark night. The town waited ahead with lanterns glowing faintly in windows. When they reached the blacksmith shop, Alder helped her down from the wagon, and she felt the strength in his hand, the steady warmth that kept her upright. Inside the shop, the coals still glowed from earlier work. Lyria sat on a stool, trembling despite the warmth. Alder watched her for a moment, checking if she wanted to speak. She wasn't sure she could. He stepped out back to unhitch the horses, but he kept glancing toward the open fields as if expecting shadows to move. When he came inside again, he closed the shop door with a firmness that wasn't violent, but carried a message. He told Lyria that the riders wouldn't enter town without thinking twice. Redwood Crossing valued peace, and Sheriff Dalton kept a hard line when strangers threatened any woman, but Lyria could see the worry in Alder's eyes. He didn't say it, but she understood. Reddick's men didn't care about lines or law. They followed a man whose money called louder than justice. Lyria asked quietly if Alder thought the riders would try to take her at night. Alder answered truthfully. He said they might. That was who they were. But he promised he would not let them. His voice didn't rise. It didn't break. It carried the steady weight of a man who knew danger and did not run from it. That night, Lyria couldn't sleep. She lay on the cot in the back room, listening for footsteps, waiting for hooves. Every creak made her flinch. Every gust of wind brushing against the wall felt like a hand reaching for her. She kept staring at the curtain that separated her small room from the main shop. Alder had left the lantern burning low, its soft glow a reminder that she was not alone. He stayed awake at the forge, pretending to work but really watching over her. Hours passed. Her breath steadied. Dawn finally began to rise. The next day brought no relief. Word spread fast that a group of riders had camped near the South Trail. Elder Hobb mentioned them in whispers. Mara shook her head in worry when she passed the shop. And even the ranch boys, who usually laughed about everything, kept quiet. Sheriff Dalton rode out that morning, but when he returned, his face carried a look Lyria didn't like. He told Alder that the men refused to answer questions, claimed they were traveling through, yet none of them packed up their camp. They were waiting. The sheriff said he'd keep watch, but he warned Alder to be careful. That warning wasn't new to Alder, but hearing it from Dalton made it real. Too real. For the next 2 days, the tension around the town tightened. Lyria tried to continue her work, sweeping, organizing, and cooking simple meals, but every sound made her freeze. Every stranger passing by made her pulse quicken. Alder tried to keep things normal, working at the anvil, running errands, but she saw how often he checked the road, even when he didn't think she noticed. On the third morning, trouble drew closer. Tessa and Jory burst into the shop, breathless from running. Tessa said she saw one of the riders at the edge of her family's ranch, pretending to fix his saddle near their fence. Jory said another man had asked him if he had seen a woman matching Lyria's description. Alder's expression hardened. He thanked the children, then sent them home with a warning to avoid the south fields. After they left, Lyria stood near the workbench, clutching a cloth towel with trembling fingers. She felt shaken all over again. She asked Alder if they should tell the sheriff. He said yes, but added something else. Something that made her chest tighten. He said she needed to tell him the truth now. The whole truth. Before the riders made their next move, Lyria knew he was right. She swallowed hard and told him everything she had tried to outrun. She told him how Reddick came to her after her father died, offering protection in exchange for work and loyalty. She told him how Reddick's kindness turned to control, how his men watched her, how he claimed she owed him more than wages. She told him how the contract she signed was twisted into something she had never intended. Reddick said she belonged to his ranch, but belonging and ownership are different things, and he treated them as the same. When she finally tried to leave, Reddick's anger broke into violence. She escaped only because a ranch hand, with a shred of mercy, unlocked the gate. She never stole money. She took nothing but her freedom. Alder listened without interrupting once, not even when her voice broke. When she finished, he didn't speak right away. He simply stepped closer and placed a steady hand on her shoulder, the warmth grounding her like a rope pulled from drowning waters. He said she had done nothing wrong, and he said Reddick's men would not take her back, not while he breathed. Later that afternoon, Sheriff Dalton returned. He said the riders were growing restless. They were circling the ranch roads, asking questions in ways that made folks uneasy. He warned Alder to avoid traveling alone and advised Lyria to stay inside the shop or inside Alder's cabin. Dalton was doing all he could within the law, but Reddick's men weren't waiting for legal doors. They were waiting for openings. That evening, Alder made a choice. He said they would move Lyria to his cabin for the night. It was remote, but safer, with fewer roads leading to it. She agreed, though fear churned inside her. Before they left, Alder locked the shop doors and loaded the small wagon again. He gave her a cloak to hide her face, not because he was ashamed of her, but because he didn't trust the eyes watching from the distance. As they traveled toward the cabin, the sky darkened with heavy clouds, the kind that carried both rain and trouble. The wind picked up, rustling the cottonwoods along the trail. Near the ridge, Alder slowed the wagon. He sensed something off, something wrong in the air, and then he saw it. Tracks, fresh ones, hoofprints deep in the dirt, circling the area like wolves testing a fence. Alder's jaw tightened. He told Lyria to stay low. She crouched near the seat, clutching the side rail. He guided the horses forward slowly, eyes scanning every shadow. The trail stretched silent and empty, but the emptiness itself felt like a trap waiting to spring. Halfway to the cabin, they heard a distant whistle. Lyria stiffened. Alder's hand moved toward the rifle under the bench. The whistle came again, sharper this time, like a signal. A horse snorted in the dark. Then another. Shapes moved near the trees, too many to be wild mustangs. Alder stopped the wagon. The air grew thick. Lyria's heart felt like it might break through her chest, and then, from the shadows, stepped the man with the scar across his cheek. He didn't smile this time. He didn't taunt. He simply stared at them as if he had been waiting all evening. The other riders fanned out behind him, blocking the narrow trail. The horses pawed the ground, restless and ready. Alder rose from his seat slowly, gripping the rifle but keeping the barrel lowered for the moment. The scarred man spoke in a low voice, saying Lyria had run long enough. He ordered her to come down from the wagon. Alder stepped between them, his voice steady. He told the riders to back away, that Lyria was under his protection and under the watch of the law. The scarred man laughed once, short and cold. He said the law meant nothing out here. He said Reddick's claim was stronger than any sheriff's badge. When Alder refused to move, the men shifted, hands reaching for weapons. Lyria's breath caught. Time slowed. Every sound grew sharper. The wind through the trees, the creak of saddle leather, the quiet click of a gun hammer being drawn back. Alder positioned himself in front of the wagon, feet braced, shoulders set. He stared at the scarred man without blinking. Lyria saw something change in Alder's eyes, a fire she had never seen before. A fire that said he would not give her up, not for anything. Then the scarred man gave a nod, a signal. The riders began to spread wider, closing in on the trail like a tightening noose. Lyria's heart pounded. Alder lifted the rifle, and the night held its breath as the storm finally began to break. The night held still as the scarred man's riders tightened their circle, their silhouettes shifting in the darkness like wolves preparing to strike. The trail was narrow, bordered by thick trees and sloping ground that echoed every shuffle of hoof or crunch of twig. Lyria stayed crouched behind the wagon seat, fingers digging into the wood until her knuckles turned pale. It felt as if the world had shrunk into a single moment, and every breath she took felt stolen. Alder stood firm between her and the threat, the rifle steady in his grip. His shoulders squared as if he had anchored himself into the earth. The scarred man stepped forward first, the fire in his eyes revealing all the ugliness of the life he served. He demanded Lyria's surrender with a tone that carried no patience. It was not a request. It was a reminder of the fear she had lived with for too long. But Alder refused to let the man finish his threat. He told him that Lyria chose her own future now, and that no one riding under Reddick's name was going to decide it for her. The scarred man signaled again with a flick of his fingers. This time, the riders prepared to move as a single force. Their hands hovered over weapons. Their horses shifted as tension ran through them. The air grew tight. Lyria wanted to scream for Alder to step back, to run, to save himself. But her voice refused to move. Then, before the riders could advance another pace, another sound cut through the dark hoofbeats, many of them, fast, determined. Alder stiffened. The scarred man's head twisted toward the ridge. Lyria peeked over the wagon seat, her heart thudding hard. Lanterns flickered through the trees, bouncing with the rhythm of horses. Voices rose, strong and clear. Among them, she recognized Sheriff Dalton's command. Fierce and unyielding. A group of townsfolk rode in behind him, armed and ready. Ranchers, shopkeepers, workers from the livery yard, they came as one force, with lantern light glowing on their faces. They weren't soldiers, but they were the spirit of Redwood Crossing. And more than that, there were people who refused to let injustice claim the land they called home. Dalton called out for the riders to stand down. His voice snapped across the trail like a whip. The scarred man's confidence faltered for the first time. The riders behind him watched the growing glow of lanterns as more townsfolk spilled into the narrow path. They weren't outnumbered, but they were outmatched in determination. Dalton pointed his rifle at the scarred man and told him the truth, that whatever lies Reddick had twisted into letters carried no legal power here, that no one could take a woman by force under the name of a contract she never willingly signed, that Redwood Crossing wasn't a place where a man's shadow could rule the lives of others, and that if the riders wanted to test the resolve of the town, they were welcome to try. The scarred man scanned the faces in the lantern glow. There were old men with steady hands, young boys with jaws set in stone, mothers who held rifles with the same steadiness they held their families. The riders shifted uneasily. Their leader realized that if he took one step forward, he would become a man who sparked a battle he could never win. He spat to the side, cursed under his breath, and told his men to fall back. They turned their horses, casting dark looks at the town they never intended to anger. As they retreated into the night, the scarred man shouted one final threat. That Reddick would not forget this. That Lyria would remain marked in his eyes. But the threat carried far less weight now, because Redwood Crossing had already chosen its side. When the riders disappeared down the far trail, Dalton approached Alder and told him they'd be guarding the roads for several nights. Others nodded, offering their help to watch the shop, the cabin, and anywhere Lyria might rest. They didn't ask for thanks. They simply acted. It's the same way small towns do when they protect their own. The lantern brigade slowly scattered, turning to their homes under the rising moon. Dalton stayed longer, advising Alder on what the next few days might bring. But he believed Reddick's men would retreat fully, knowing the town wouldn't be frightened. Eventually, he left, promising to return by dawn, when Alder finally climbed back onto the wagon. Lyria rose from her crouched position. Her legs shook so badly she could hardly stand, and when she stepped onto the road, she nearly collapsed. Alder caught her, steadying her with a strong hand on her arm. She felt something inside her finally give way, not in fear, but in exhaustion. She whispered apologies, afraid she had dragged him into something unforgivable. But Alder shook his head. He told her she hadn't brought danger. She had brought truth. And truth was worth standing for, even if shadows chased it. He guided her into the wagon and climbed up beside her. The trail to the cabin felt calmer now, as if the land itself had exhaled after holding its breath too long. When they reached the cabin, Alder lit a lantern and helped her inside. It felt different tonight, warmer, safer. As if the walls understood what had just been protected, Lyria sat on the edge of the narrow bed, hands trembling as she tried to fold her cloak. Alder knelt in front of her and gently took the cloak from her grip. He set it aside, then rested a hand over hers. He told her she didn't need to fear the night anymore, that the riders wouldn't return, that the town had seen her, understood her, and chosen to stand beside her. She asked him why he had done so much for someone he barely knew. Alder took a long breath. He told her that strength isn't only measured in muscle or fire, but in the courage it takes to flee from harm, to seek a life better than the one forced upon you. He told her that when she stood in his shop, shaking, thinking she needed permission just to change her clothes, something inside him had broken. Not in pity, but in anger for what she had endured. And in admiration for what she still hoped for, he said he believed in her. Even before she believed in herself, tears filled her eyes, soft and warm, like a release she had never allowed herself before. She didn't weep from fear. She wept because she had finally found a place where her voice mattered, where her story wasn't twisted by others, where her future no longer belonged to someone who saw her as property. Alder placed a hand against her cheek, steady and gentle. He didn't rush her. He didn't claim her. He didn't declare ownership the way Reddick had tried to. Instead, he said she could stay as long as she wished. Work the cabin, help with the ledger, join the life he was building on this land. And if one day she wanted something more, something beyond work and safety, he'd let her speak it first. Lyria looked into his eyes, seeing not a savior but a partner, a man who offered strength without force, a man who believed freedom was a right, not a gift. She whispered that she wanted to stay, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because this place felt like the first true home she had ever known. Alder smiled, faint but warm, told her she had already changed the cabin just by walking into it. Over the next days, the threat faded into the distance. The riders never returned. Dalton reported that Reddick had been confronted by lawmen in a distant town for matters unrelated, which kept him too distracted to pursue his twisted claims. With pressure mounting from both law and community, his hold on distant land began to crumble. Reducing the reach he once had, Redwood Crossing eased back into its rhythm. The townsfolk welcomed Lyria with open hearts. Mara brought her bread. Elder Hobbs' wife gave her extra linens. Tessa and Jory visited the cabin often, claiming it felt like a second home with Lyria's gentle presence there. Alder continued his work at the forge, the sound of iron and fire shaping the days. Lyria kept the cabin warm, the books organized, and the small garden alive. Sometimes when the sun dipped behind the hills, Alder sat with her on the porch, where they shared stories, quiet laughter, and hopes for the days ahead. Their bond grew naturally, like the slow bloom of a wildflower that refuses to be rushed. It grew from trust, respect, and the simple truth that two broken pasts could build one strong future. No one asked Lyria to surrender her freedom again. No one demanded fear from her. She lived with dignity, with safety, with a man who valued her voice and her choices. And in the quiet evenings, when the wind settled low, she knew that the moment she had asked Alder that trembling question in his shop had changed. Her life in a way she could have never imagined. Not in shame, not in fear, but in revelation, because instead of claiming her, Alder had protected her. Instead of owning her, he had honored her. And instead of letting her slip back into the shadows of her past, he had helped her step into a future bright as the rising sun over Redwood Crossing. Lyria's life began not with escape, but with the courage to hope again. And in that hope, she found not just safety, but love.